Hello, everyone, and welcome to part two of chapter 12, chapter 13. Apologize. Um, what we're going to be looking at is the nerve plexuses and reflexes and neuronal pools and things like that. So I do cover these, though they're covered in lab. I go over them a little bit, just really more so kind of what some of the text information that's like multiple choice questions is going to be on the lab final next class. So next week. Okay. So let's start with our nerve plexuses, our cervical plexus. So I already introduced the nerve plexuses in lab, so I don't really worry too much. But let's do the cervical plexus. Now, in the cervical plexus, we have it's the ventral rami or the nerve roots. The nerve roots or ventral rami are the same things. They are C1 to C4 with contributions from C5. So what we got going on here is C1, C2, C3, C4. Then C5 comes from below and comes up, which is also C5 is part of the brachial plexus. So it innervates. It means it makes the muscles to work. The muscles of the head and neck, the diaphragm, and parts of the shoulders. And I use the mnemonic for GTA, please, sir. Greater auricular, transverse cervical, ansa cervical or ansa cervicalis, phrenic, and supraclavicular nerves. Okay. Now, brachial plexus, this is C5 to C8. So see C5 here, C5, and then there's contributions from T1. C5 is going to be the one that is coming up from here, going up to cervical. Contributions from C4. C4 was part of cervical plexus. It contributes here. So basically, C5 is part of brachial plexus, contributes to cervical plexus. C4 is part of cervical plexus, contributes to brachial plexus. It innervates the muscles of your upper limb and shoulder. Okay. I use the mnemonic, most alcoholics must really urinate. Musculocutaneous, actually, most alcoholics must, median, really, radial, urinate, ulnar. Okay. Most alcoholics must really urinate. That's your main nerves. Lumbar plexus. So this is T12 to L4. This innervates the abdominal wall, the external genitals, and part of your lower limbs. I use the mnemonic fig oil, femoral, iliohypogastric, genitofemoral, obturator, ilioinguinal, and lateral femoral cutaneous. Fig oil. Okay, so that kind of gives me a little mnemonic that I use. Mnemonic devices to kind of remember the different. So your lumbar plexus, if you want to help the lumbar plexus feel better, rub some fig oil on it. One of the ways people do this, I can do two different things. I had fist pop pop, but I can say fists pop pop, Fists, like plural of fist. Okay, fist pop pop. But this is L4 to L5, S1 to S4. This innervates your buttocks, your perineum, your pelvic floor, lower limb. Okay, so this is FISTS, fists. That's kind of one I use actually now more than any. Pop, pop, pop. Okay, so our fibular, our inferior gluteal, our superior gluteal, our sciatic, and our tibial, pudendal, and the posterior femoral cutaneous. Together, the sacral plexus and the lumbar plexus descend down and create your lower nerves. So I talk about that in lab more because that's more of a lab thing I really worry about there. Now, let's get into neuronal pools. Let's talk about how the body basically has about 10 million sensory neurons, about 500,000 motor neurons, but about 20 billion interneurons. This tells us pretty much that interneurons are quite important. Your sensory neurons, they do deliver information to the CNS, and the motor neurons carry things from the CNS out to visceral effectors. But in between, there's the interneurons, and they're the ones that are involved in interpretation, planning, coordination of everything coming and going. They're what helps us make sense of the world. They're important for learning and things like that. One of the things these interneurons do is they get grouped into what is called neuronal pools. Okay, the neuronal pools can get put into circuits, basically. These neuronal pool circuits. A divergent circuit is where you have one neuron spreads to several neurons. Okay, one spread to many. Convergence, many spread to one. Serial processing, one to one to the next in a stepwise sequence. Parallel, one to many or two to many, the spread of information from several neurons that are parallel. So I have information is transmitted simultaneously, but they are parallel to each other. They had this, that basically makes the same information go in the same direction at same time. There is reverberation. A neuron comes back, so the blue neuron is sending a signal to the purple neuron. The purple neuron goes back to the blue neuron and stimulates it in a positive feedback loop, a positive feedback mechanism called reverberation. Collateral branches are used to return back and increase the stimulation of the first neuron in the system in a positive negative feedback loop. A positive feedback loop. I think I said positive negative. If I said that, I apologize. A positive feedback loop. Sometimes I say words. Sometimes it's been a long week. I'm tired. So sometimes I do that. My voice is a little strained. I've been going all week. So, all right. Reflexes are a big deal. Very important aspect to understanding. I always kind of say this is kind of the quintessential thing to understand neural circuitry. A reflex is a rapid automatic response to a stimulus. What they are, there's three parts to them. You need a receptor to detect it, you need an integration center to process it, and you need an effector to respond. Those three things are really important aspects. Now, given that, we can take and describe reflexes, especially based on where they integrate and what kind of effector responds, is a really big component to how we can classify reflexes. So let's start with the reflex arc. We're going to start with a stimulus. So this might be something like you step on a thumbtack, or you touch a hot stove eye, or the doctor hits your knee with that rubber mallet. This stimulus is anything that gets set off a reflex. The stimulus happens, and that activates a receptor. Receptors, what's important about them to know is they are sensitive to things. Receptors are sensitive to very specific stimuli. Very specific ones. For example, one might be temperature, one might be calcium levels, one might be pH levels, one might be touch, stretch, something like that. Any kind of receptor can set off. It is a physical or chemical change in the body can set off a receptor. Once the receptor fires, it stimulates an action potential in a sensory neuron. Sensory neuron is activated. That goes all the way into the dorsal root ganglia, where it comes into your spinal cord. There in the spinal cord, there in the central nervous system, that information gets received, and it comes in, okay, and is ready to be processed and ready to be sent out. A motor neuron goes out the ventral root, generates a motor neuron, comes out the PNS, that reaches the motor neuron, it travels down to an effector. The effector, the peripheral effector, could be a muscle cell like smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, whatever, glands, heart, things like that. Okay, things that can respond, and that results in response in the target organ. So we need to know these steps in a reflex arc. So basically you'll see here, like this is a thumbtack. Thumbtack is a stimulus. You put your hand on a thumbtack, a receptor in the hand detects that stimulus. So the receptor is activated, the stimulus, the receptor is activated. The receptor activates a sensory neuron. The sensory neuron then comes in. We then will potentially get a interneuron involved. We go to our motor neuron. Motor neuron goes out the ventral root, out to our effector, and that can cause us to withdraw from that particular thing. Okay, so that's going to be an important component. Okay, all right. Now, how can we classify these things? One of the things we can do is by when they develop. We can look at when they develop. Are you born with them, or do you learn them? Are these things that you are born with, they're present at birth? Or are these things you get by what you learn by training that you receive, military, for example, police training, healthcare training, particular things. One of the things, because of reflexes, you will revert to your lowest level of training. So by development, when they develop, if you're born with it, if it's present at birth, it's called an innate reflex. If it is learned, like the reflexes you get when driving, the reflexes you get in sports, the reflexes you get in the military, these are acquired reflexes. Now, what we also can get is by what response? By response. Who responds? Is this an autonomic reflex, like for example, the swallowing reflex, pupillary reflex, the vomiting reflex? Is it a smooth muscle, cardiac muscle gland, or adipose cell that responds? That would be a visceral reflex. Somatic reflexes or skeletal muscles respond, like a knee-jerk reaction. Now, another thing we can look at is how complex the circuit is. It can be monosynaptic, where basically there's a sensory neuron and a motor neuron only. That's your common type, most common. That's like your knee-jerk reflex. And polysynaptic, there is at least one interneuron between it, gives us more complicated things. For example, cross-extensor reflexes and things like that. Site of information process, where is it processed? Is it processed in the brain? It's called a cranial reflex. Is it processed in the spinal cord? It's called a spinal reflex. Basically, that's all there is to that. Okay? All right. So we can look at reflexes by development, by response, by complexity, by processing site. And there it is broken down in a nice little flow chart. All right, we can look at types of reflexes. We can talk about stretch reflexes. That regulates the length of your skeletal muscles. We can talk about tendon reflexes. They monitor the external tension on tendons. They're actually making during muscle contraction. They prevent tearing, breaking of tendons and things like that. So if the tension on tendon is too strong, it regulates the muscle contraction and prevent it from breaking. Important withdrawal reflexes, like if I touch a hot stove eye or a hot piece of metal or sharp, like I put my hand on a thumbtack, okay? Withdrawal reflexes, these are going to be pulling apart things. Now, we have what's called cross-extensor reflexes. They can involve responses that occur on the opposite side of the stimulus, like if I push you on the left or right side braces. Okay, this requires ipsilateral and contralateral stuff. Ipsilateral means that the movement happens on the same side as the stimulus. Contralateral means the movement happens on the opposite side of the stimulus. For a cross-extensor reflex, we need a contralateral thing to happen. Okay. All right. So reflexes, they are there's a variety of them, very simple ones to more complex ones that, like, for us to get ourselves stabilized and things like that. When I talk about this with stretch reflexes for muscles, so muscles we talk about how we don't want to tear the tendon. We don't want to damage the tendon. We need to be able to tell that a muscle is too tense. We use what's called a muscle spindle to do that. These specialized muscle bundles called intrafusal muscle fibers. Intrafusal fibers are in there. And then they're surrounded by the extrafusal. Those are the ones that actually, the extrafusal muscles, they're the ones who actually do the contraction. The intrafusal, they're more specially for the muscle spindle to actually detect the stretch. Now, sensory and motor innervate the intrafusal fibers, but the sensory neuron wraps around it, forming a very strong sensory region to the CNS. Now, what happens is there is a motor command that's sent to these called gamma efferents. Okay, so the sensory goes out, and the motor that comes to them is called a gamma efferent. And this is what helps control the tension, is these systems here. Okay, all right, we're done. We're done. Can you believe it? We got one more chapter to go. Really short, sweet, simple, easy to go. I could have done it all in one shot, but I wanted to break this up because we had the time to do it. Okay. So guys, thank you, and I will see you in the next one.